Good evening and welcome to this evening's talk. My name is Alan Benstock and I'm actually replacing Jonathan Strait, who unfortunately cannot join us this evening because of the time difference between here and Israel and his commitments there as part of taking one of his photography projects for one of the charities there. So for those that don't know me, I'm normally the person behind the scenes that you certainly shouldn't see when one of these talks. So I'm going to be doing everything myself. So please accept any apologies if everything isn't quite as smooth as usual. So I'm delighted to welcome you all to here this evening, wherever you are in the UK, and more importantly, wherever you are in the world, because I know from the lists and registrations, there are people joining us from the United States, Canada, and Israel. So our series of online talks and conversations continue with our guest, Mike Levy, who I'll introduce shortly. But first, some housekeeping points. And these are that if you do ask, please ask questions. There will be time after Mike's talk to do this. But you can do this either in the chat or in the Q&A. I will be monitoring both. And of course, we'll try and get through as many as we can in the time that allows. I'd of course also draw your attention to the chat facility, and if you select everyone, you can send messages there. And finally, this event is being recorded and will be available on the Millen website in the next few days, and which is also where you can find recordings of our other talks over the past now couple of years. I think I was counting up that we've got well over 100. And so to our guest, Mike, here we go, who is joining us. Mike Levy was born in Leeds and is a professional researcher for the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation, as well as an educator, playwright and journalist. He holds a fellowship in Holocaust education from the Imperial War Museum and is a frequent educator on the Lessons from Auschwitz programme. Mike is also the chair of Harwich Kindertransport Memorial Appeal, an organisation that has recently unveiled a new sculpture at the place where most of the refugee children will have had their first sight of freedom. While he writes and speaks on many subjects, including Gershwin and Soviet jazz musicians, he's most in demand for subjects relating to the history of the Kindertransport. May I also add that he is a long-standing friend of Millen. He's worked on a number of projects. For those of you in Leeds who will recall that we had a play that was produced before the pandemic in 2018, which was marking the end of the First World War, which was about his uncle that he wrote and from his letters, and their recordings are available on the Millen website. But more importantly, he with Anthony Cavane are working on a very special project, which you'll all hear more about towards the end of the year, which will be part of the Leeds 2023 Year of Culture, but that is for next year. So I'm delighted, as I say, to be welcoming Mike. So this evening, he's actually going to be talking about his most recent work, Get the Children Out, Unsung Heroes of the Kindertransport. So, Mike, over to you in Cambridge.
Thank you very much.
There we go. And with a bit of tech, we'll just do a bit of screen swapping. And there we go. There you go. There you go, Mike.
Okay, hello. Well, thank you, Alan, for that very kind and lengthy introduction to me. Welcome everyone to my little pad here in Cambridge in the east of England, where it's actually chucking it down with rain. Perhaps not unusually this evening. As Alan quite rightly mentioned, my latest work, if you like, is a book called Get the Children Out, Unsung Heroes of the Kindertransport, which came out a few months ago, and it relates, as you'll see in the talk I'm going to give today, to some questions that I actually asked myself, or I've been asking myself as an educator in Holocaust education, in Holocaust history, over the last few years, and we'll come on to that in a moment. The very first thing I'm going to do is to see whether I can share screen with you, and hopefully I can. Perhaps Alan can tell me whether everyone can see this. Yeah?
Absolutely fine.
Absolutely fine, great, okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the actual book itself as I conclude my remarks today. So let's start off with my first slide here. Some of you may have seen, perhaps many of you have seen this memorial collection of figures at Liverpool Street Station in London. Not in Liverpool as one book says, it's Liverpool Street Station in London. It's called The Arrival, and it commemorates the arrival of some of the 10,000 children who came on the so-called Kindertransport, the children's transports, from Germany, Austria, Czech, some from Poland, to Britain between the end of 1938 and the outbreak of war in September 39. And it's a very powerful monument, a very powerful set of 5 figures produced by Frank Meisler, a sculptor who himself had been on the Kindertransport in the late 1930s. It's a very poignant statue, and it shows railway lines, suitcases, what are now quite familiar, iconic emblems of the Kindertransport programme itself. Now, when we think of the Kindertransport and the organisation of it, perhaps one name comes, if any names, perhaps one name above all comes to mind. That is the name of Sir Nicholas Winton. Many of you may remember, if you're as old as I am, Nicholas Winton appearing on the programme That's Life with Esther Ranson in the late 1980s, in which the story of his rescue, or part rescue, of the Kindertransport children was told seemingly for the first time. And so since then, since the late 80s, and until Sir Nicholas's death in the year 2015 at the age of 106, he has been associated really with the organisation of the transport trains and the ships, and in some cases planes, that got the children here to safety out of the clutches of the Nazis. And so famous is Sir Nicholas that in May 2020, on what would have been his 111th birthday, there was a Google Doodle, which, as you know, is the image that goes above the Google logo. And here you can see a kind of artistic interpretation of a young man with glasses. That's Sir Nicholas as a young man on his knee, shaking hands with some small children, getting off a train, presumably at Liverpool Street Station, welcoming them to safety in Britain.
Mike, could you just speak up a little bit? It might be that the internet signal is making you a bit quiet, if that's possible.
How's that? Is that better?
I think so, yes. Just, yeah, should be all right.
I'll speak up a bit. So the question really that came to my mind is that 10,000 children were rescued in that period that I mentioned before. Of those, 90% of the children came from what the Germans called the German Reich, in other words, Austria and Germany. As you know, Austria was annexed by Germany in March 1938. So 6% of the children who came from what we now call the Czech Republic, or Czech lands of Czech and Slovakia, and then in those days called Czechoslovakia. Now, Sir Nicholas Winton spent all of his months organising the Kindertransport trains only from Prague, from the Czech country, from the Czech lands. He was never involved at all in the rescue of children from Germany, combined Germany. So my question that I was asking myself in the last few years is, if 6% came from the Czech lands and 94% came from Germany, Austria and Poland, mostly from Germany, who were the people, who were the Nicholas Wintons who helped organise those transports? And the answer generally is that we have forgotten. The names are not well known unless you're a scholar in this particular area. And that, to me, as a journalist as well as historian, meant that here was a wrong that had to be righted. And as I started looking at the names of the people involved in the Kindertransport rescue, it really became very clear that the rescue of these 10,000 children, by the way, the largest single rescue throughout the entire Holocaust period, and most of the children coming to Britain, it seemed to me that these were the people who helped to organise and rescue the children should be remembered. So before we go on to have a look at some of the people who are in my book and some of the people who are remembered by the book, let me just go back a stage and give you a little bit of background history in case you're a bit rusty on how the Kindertransport came about. It began, as I said, in late November 1938. Now, there were hundreds, if maybe low thousands of registrations already in place. Parents desperate to get their children out of danger, particularly in Austria, following the Anschluss in March 38, and then in Germany. Really, the anti-Jewish measures against both men, women and children, of course, were building slowly from the rise of Hitler in 1933 right up to this period. And it became clear to many of the desperate parents that their lives were now in some danger, and it was the most parental thing that one could do, although a huge wrench, was to get the children on a train out of Germany, on a ship possibly as well, to safety. There were desperate calls from Jewish organisations in Germany and Austria to find secure places, for places of safety for their children. Also, again, a background here that we could spend a whole evening on, but we don't have time, was the British attitude to Palestine, to mandate Palestine as it was then. And in fact, the Kindertransport kind of coincides with a plea by the Jewish agencies, in fact the Jewish agency, to allow 10,000 German children into Palestine in late 1938. That was rejected by the British government, and so to some extent one could argue that the Kindertransport was, I wouldn't say a sop, but was an alternative arrangement, if you like, offered by the British government rather than sending the children to Palestine. There were also pleas from Jewish and Quaker representatives in London to allow the children, allow at least the children, to escape the clutches of the Nazis. And there was moral outrage in the press and church circles, and synagogue circles for that matter, particularly the Archbishop Lang, who led the charge on this, Otto Schiff in London from the Jewish agencies, following the events of Kristallnacht on the 9th and 10th of November 1938, which was the largest pogrom organised at that point by the Nazis. There were also reassurances from the British side, from the agencies in Britain, that if the children were allowed into Britain, allowed into a safe haven, if you like, that the British taxpayer would not be responsible, and therefore that all the monies to support the children would be raised by voluntary means. That brings us on to, I wouldn't call him an unsung hero, but certainly someone whose name ought to be at least in the memory, that of the Home Secretary Sir Samuel Hoare. Samuel Hoare was from a Quaker family. The Hoare family were a well-known Quaker family, although it's doubtful whether he himself was a practicing Quaker, if that's the right term. But he was a man of moral, upright standing, and in about November 21st, 1938, a delegation went to the Home Office to argue for the release at least of the children from Germany and Austria, if not their parents. And Hall considered what they had to say. He was also outraged by the events of Kristallnacht. And though he was an arch believer in appeasement, he was one of Neville Chamberlain's right-hand men, he nevertheless saw the moral case for allowing the children into Britain. And so what the government did, announced on the 21st of November 1938 in Parliament, was essentially no more and no less than a visa waiver scheme. In other words, the government would allow unaccompanied children up to the age of 17, those children regarded as being in particular danger, either from Jewish families or from families that were not Jewish but had Jewish roots and were labelled by the Nazis as Jews. The children would be allowed in, given the caveat that they wouldn't be paid for by the taxpayer, and that all the organisations of the children would be done by volunteers. What the government did was to waive the visa regulations, which were very strict and very tight, and so the children were allowed in on what we might call a kind of group permit, which was really very simple to get. And so began really on the 2nd of December 1938 the first arrival of Kindertransport children. Notice, by the way, the very rapid turn of events. Kristallnacht is on the 9th and 10th of November. 2 weeks later, a delegation goes to Samuel Hall asking for children to be allowed into Britain, and he allows that. 2 weeks after that, the first arrival of the first group of Kindertransport children into the port of Harwich. Nearly all of them from German children's homes in Leipzig, Hamburg, Hanover and so on. So the government have given the green light for children to be brought out from Germany. The question then is, how is that going to happen? How are they going to be brought here? Who is going to look after them once they're here? How is it all going to be paid for? And so on and so on and so on. And so one of the first people I would like to just very quickly introduce you to is that of Helen Bentwich. Helen Bentwich, as you can see from the National Portrait Gallery portrait here, has a chain around her neck, and that indicates in fact that she was had been the chair of the London County Council Education Committee, so very much steeped in education. She was also wife of Norman Bentwich, who had been Attorney General in Mandate Palestine, one of the kind of elite Anglo-Jewish families. And she decided that such was the sense of urgency in Germany and Austria, particularly this time, that she set up an organisation called, slightly ungainly title, of the Movement for the Care of Children from Germany, the MCCG. And this was very much the London end, or the British end, of the organisation to help get those children out of Germany. But of course, Helen couldn't operate alone, and she decided to set up with others a refugee headquarters in central London in Bloomsbury House. And there you can see a contemporary photograph, after I took it, of Bloomsbury House in Bloomsbury Street. And that large building, it had been a hotel, was the effective headquarters, the nerve centre of the Kindertransport rescue scheme, along with other refugees from Germany as well. Interestingly, the Bloomsbury House on Bloomsbury Street has no blue plaque or any kind of indication that throughout the war, in fact right up to 1947, this building, full of hundreds of people, mostly volunteer workers, was the nerve centre of this massive, by their standards, refugee rescue. Now, although Bloomsbury House was the centre of the rescue, the tentacles of Bloomsbury House spread out throughout the whole country. And the rescue, of course, had also to be done at a local and regional level. So, for instance, in Leeds, the Leeds Refugee Committee was set up more or less the same time, based at their headquarters in Bransby Lodge, which is now a part of the Northern School of Contemporary Dance in what was the new synagogue in Chapeltown Road. That became the headquarters, and one of the Refugee Committee members, some of you may remember if you're old Leedsites like me, Udensians, that of David Makowski, who played a very important role in the running of the Leeds Refugee Committee. But they were all responsible to the headquarters at Bloomsbury House, and there were constant toing and froing between the refugee committees around the country, including at Bransby Lodge, and the headquarters of Helen Bentwich's Bloomsbury House.
Mike, can you, sorry to interrupt again, can you just come a bit closer to the computer, because you're obviously using a computer mic and it's a bit quiet. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Quite a few people have done that. Sorry about that. I For people watching, I can't control the volume.
Okay. Okay, so I'll try and speak up. Um, Helen Bentwich, of course, couldn't do all this herself, and one of the genius, I think, elements of her work was that she was a fantastic team player, and she brought together a team, mostly of women, interestingly, at Bloomsbury House to help run the London end, or the British end, of the head of the Kindertransport programme. People like Lola Hahn Warburg, who had been part of the Warburg merchant banking family, herself a German exile from the Nazis, and came with an amazing contact book. She kind of knew all the Jewish agencies and all the Jewish important people in Germany. Elaine Blond, who was the sister of Simon Marks, the head of Marks and Spencer. Stella Isaacs, Lady Reading, who later on, a few months later, came up with the idea of the Woman's Voluntary Service, the WRVS. And Rebecca Seif, another sister in the Marks family. So Helen Bentwich brought together this very powerful team, some men as well, but mainly these women, all based at Bloomsbury House, manning the switchboards, manning the telephones, organising the trains and the welfare provision for the children. It was an immense programme which went on relatively under the radar. So that's kind of London end of the British end of the organisation. But let me take you back to the continent and introduce you to this very remarkable lady, Gertrude Weissmuller-Meyer, Christian lady who was based in Amsterdam. She'd been a social worker through the 1930s, but after Kristallnacht, and in fact leading up to Kristallnacht, the Jewish agencies in London, the Bentwiches and Elaine Marks and so on, wanted someone they could rely on to help organise the trains coming through the Netherlands and also to negotiate with the Nazis, because of course Jews in Nazi land had to have permission from the Nazis to actually leave. And so Helen Bentwich's husband Norman contacted Gertrude Weissmuller-Meyer and said, "We can't do this, but could you go and negotiate with the leading Nazi in Vienna, the Nazi responsible for Jewish so-called emigration," which meant persecution and bullying and so on. And she, without hesitation, Weissmuller-Meyer agreed to go to Vienna from Amsterdam, 2 flights, one into Berlin and one down to Vienna. And there she met the so-called head of Jewish emigration department. I don't know whether you can see the guy there. He later became absolutely infamous, and his name is Adolf Eichmann. But in December 1938, he was head of Jewish emigration. You could call it Jewish exile. She negotiated with him despite having been thrown into jail on her arrival in Vienna as a British spy. She created all kinds of fuss and bother until she was released, demanded to see Eichmann, went to Eichmann, who tried to humiliate her and couldn't believe that any Aryan would want to save Jews, but she demanded that he allowed the children from Vienna to leave. And he said, "Madam, I will allow 600 children to leave as long as you organise this within 5 days." He wanted the children out of Vienna. I think it was Tuesday. He wanted the children out on Saturday, and he deliberately chose Saturday because that was Shabbat, and he knew it would be difficult for some of the children to get permission to go. Completely undaunted, Gertrude organised with the Vienna Jewish agencies, the IKG it was called, several carriages to take the children out of Vienna on the Saturday after she had arrived. 600 children on that train. 600, the largest Kindertransport of the entire Kindertransport period. Nicholas Winton, God bless him, I knew him well, wonderful man, arranged for 669 children to leave Prague from around about really January 39 to the end of August 39. 669. She gets 600 children on one train and then continues to organise the hundreds, if not thousands, of more children coming from Vienna and also from Berlin. So she is a most remarkable figure, and I devote a chapter to her. Although someone there also this year brought out, I think it was the end of last year, brought out a documentary film called Truss's Children. Truss was her nickname, and I do recommend you to see it. So she is definitely one of my unsung heroes, as is Helen Bentwich. Another of my heroes is Wilfrid Israel. Wilfrid Israel was the equivalent owner, or he was the owner of the equivalent of Harrods in Berlin. It was called N. Israel and Co. His father had founded this huge department store. And he was lucky in the sense that he had joint Anglo-German citizenship. That gave him a little bit more leeway to operate more freely under the gaze and the guise of the Nazis. And he was the head of the German Jewish organisation called the Reichsvertretung der Juden in Deutschland, and also the Hilfsverein. These were self-help organisations that really struggled against Nazi persecution to do what they could to help the benighted Jews in Germany. And it was Israel's real kind of focus to try at least to get the children out. You could say that between Wilfrid Israel and Helen Bentwich and one or two others, the Kindertransport, whole idea of the Kindertransport was theirs. Now, again, none of these people could act alone. To get 10,000 children out in a few months required a huge team. And on Wilfrid Israel's team was this lady, Kate Rosenheim, who was head of the Department of Children's Emigration in Berlin. It's thought that she helped to rescue over 7,000 children from Berlin, not just to Britain, but also to Palestine, the USA, and some of the very few countries that would actually allow Jewish immigration into the country. Working in the same office as Kate Rosenheim was this lady, Hannah Kaminski. She was the head of the League of Jewish Women, the Jüdische Frauenbund. And what's important about Hannah is that the Frauenbund, the League of Jewish Women, had offices throughout provincial Germany. So if you were a parent of a child and you were desperate to get the child out of Stuttgart or some small town in Bavaria, let's say, you would go to your local League of Jewish Women office, and there they would help complete the paperwork, negotiate with the local Nazis, and make sure that all the paperwork getting into England was properly put together. So Kaminski was really head of this very influential body. On a human level, it was also very important for me to remember Kaminski because she was the leading chaperone who came with the smallest children, sometimes as young as 2 or 3, on these trains from Germany. And she came on countless number of trains and always refused to stay in Britain where it would have been safe. She said, no, my work is not done and I must go back to Germany to get more children out. And she returned many times to Berlin, but sadly, when war broke out on the 3rd of September, all the frontiers were closed and the Jews of Germany were essentially locked in. As you can see from her date of death, 1942, I always have shudders when I see that date, and sadly it does mean what you might think it means, in that Hannah was sent to Auschwitz and murdered there. And also with Kate Rosenheim and virtually all of the women and a few men who were part of Wilfrid Israel's team were victims of the Holocaust. Nearly all of them refusing to leave their children or to leave the old and the sick. Heroes, surely. Another member of the Helen Bentwich's group, if you like, not part of her team, but certainly part of her circle, was this lady called Bertha Bracey. Bertha Bracey was the General Secretary of the British Society of Friends, essentially the Quakers. And if you speak to any Kinder or read any memoirs about the Kindertransport, they often say the Quakers played an incredibly important role, in the rescue of children out of Germany, but then once here, finding homes, foster homes, hostels, training farms, training schools, boarding schools and so on. And when they say the Quakers did this and the Quakers did that, at the centre of this huge um, humanitarian response was Bertha Bracey. And in fact, she led the delegation to go and see Samuel Hall on the 21st of November, more or less demanding that he let the children out. And she risked her life, as well as other Quakers, in going backwards and forwards into Nazi Germany to find out for herself what was happening to the Jews, reporting back to London, trying their best to set up refuge places, hiding places also for Jews, and those Jews who'd become baptized, Christian Jews and so on. So she played a very vital role. I don't have time to play the recording, which I discovered recently, languishing in the British Library, of Bertha Bracey talking about Bloomsbury House, but maybe on another occasion we'll do that. She lived, in fact, until 1989, so she lived a very long life, but almost every aspect of the rescue of Jews, you'll find Bertha Bracey behind it. For instance, if you saw that wonderful film, The Windermere Children, about the rescue of children from the camps in 1945 to Windermere in northern England, it's a fantastic film, and it's a very moving story about the 700 children who came from Buchenwald and from Theresienstadt and so on. Well, guess who was behind the organisation of that? Brackets doesn't appear in the film. Bertha Bracey. So again, unsung hero without a doubt.
Accession number 46.
Another person that ought to be remembered is this lady, Dorothy Hardisty, who was secretary of the Children's Refugee Movement, the Refugee Children's Movement, which was the successor to Helen Bentwich's hastily put together team. Really, throughout the war period, Dorothy takes over from Helen Bentwich and runs the Bloomsbury House operation. And if you ever see any records of Kindertransport cases during the war, it's always Mrs. Hardisty wants to know how little Inga is getting on. Mrs. Hardisty wants to be sure that Lotte has got her Hanukkah candles. Mrs. Hardisty wants to know if kosher food is being provided to the children in Sunderland. This kind of thing. Her name crops up time and time again. Although she was a paid employee, one of the very few, she, in my view anyway, she went far beyond her brief, tirelessly trying to support the children once they were in Britain. And this, by the way, is a very rare photograph, which was very kindly given to me by Dorothy Hardisty's granddaughter. Another name that might ring some bells is Alan Sainsbury of the Sainsbury supermarket family, one of the biggest grocery companies in Britain, and it was very large even in 1938. When Alan Sainsbury heard about Kristallnacht, he decided to rent or hire, I'm not quite sure whether he rented or bought a large house in South London and turned it into a hostel for young Jewish refugees who spent all their war period under the wing, really, of the Sainsbury family. And again, it's a remarkably little known story. The Sainsburys themselves didn't seem to know very much about what Alan had done. But here you can see a photograph which was given to me by one of the former Kinder who lived in the hostel. And we believe it's not him, but we believe it's a young man who was an artist who gave Alan Sainsbury a gift of a drawing of one of his stores as a thank you for looking after the children throughout the war period and beyond. Even into the 60s, Alan Sainsbury never missed sending a bar mitzvah card or a wedding card to a child or grandchild of these Kindertransport children. And I could go on. Frank Bond, who was the manager of the Dovercourt Bay holiday camp, a holiday camp which was really designed for summer holidays, but during the winter of 1938, Helen Bentwich came up with a very clever idea of using the camp to house the first wave of children who came from Germany and Austria. They came so rapidly there simply wasn't time to find foster homes for them. And so Frank Bond, who had been manager of the camp in the previous summer, volunteered to stay on, reopen the camp and run it as best he could, with others of course, as a transit home, as the first home for I think up to 1,500 to 2,000 of the first Jewish children who came to Britain. They spent their first weeks and months at the Dovercourt Bay holiday camp, not always very comfortably because the heating didn't work, and often the organisation was fairly chaotic. But again, I point to Frank Bond and others who ran the camp as people who at least should be remembered. I've actually got, let me just to check on the time here. Yes, I've got a little bit of time to show you some film clip. This is the first arrival of the children into Harwich, which was the main port of arrival. And you'll see them coming down the gangplank. There's no sound to this, I hope you can see that. There's a Ministry of Health official who's greeting them because he wants to make sure they've got their labels with their numbers on. And those numbers and their labels show that they are healthy. There they are arriving at Dovercourt camp. You can see the chalets in the background. And in a moment you'll see the bald head. There he is, Frank Bond himself, the manager of the camp, chatting to the children who are having their first meal in Britain, in safety, in freedom, if you like. I'm just looking at the time. I'm going to have to speed through some of these final slides. Mary Hughes was a Quaker. She was head of the York Hospitality Committee, all volunteers, and she took in 2 kinder herself, but organised through the Leeds Refugee Committee as well, with Makovsky, I believe. I haven't proof of that, but I think she probably did. She organised the arrival of many of the Kindertransport children into the Leeds and York area. And I could say a lot more about Mary Hughes, but it's all there in my book. Another remarkable character, a very quiet lady who did her work without any fuss, died in 1950s, completely forgotten. Yeah. And finally, I'm going to just say a little bit about this gentleman, Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld. Some of you may have heard of him. Orthodox, son-in-law of the Chief Rabbi Hertz, and, if you like, a one-man Kindertransport. Not for him the committees of Helen Bentwich and others. He organised his own transports. He was very much kind of a maverick who wanted to do things his way. And his way was to get, particularly to focus on the Orthodox boys and girls of Germany and Austria, who he felt were not being given a fair crack of the whip by the main committees. And so he had lots of different ways and means of cajoling the Home Office, he had friends there by the way, to provide not the Kindertransport permits but proper visas for the children to leave Vienna and Berlin. And we think he might have thanks to his efforts, he may well have succeeded in getting 700 children out between December 1938 and the outbreak of war. He didn't finish off there. He continued through the war, trying desperately to get Jews out of Germany, out of danger, out of Central Europe, Poland, out of Hungary. And he was a man who was forever cajoling and warning the British and Parliament that the Jews were being massacred in huge numbers. He was a voice that had to be heard, and he was, again, a most remarkable character. And again, without doing too much plugging, if you read my book, you'll read about his remarkable idea of buying a Caribbean island, which he did in order to bestow British citizenship on the 400,000 Jews of Hungary who remained after the Holocaust. So a remarkable figure in his own right. And by the way, if you're wondering what the uniform is that Rabbi Schonfeld is wearing, it's the uniform of the Rabbi Schonfeld Army. He designed it himself, and in true chutzpahdik fashion, he sort of didn't claim he was in the army, but it gave people the impression that he had official British status to go and open doors in Europe to help get the Jewish refugees out. And by and large, it succeeded. Talking of Harwich, by the way, I just wanted to say a little bit about some of the other work that I've been doing apart from the book. On the 1st of September this year, myself and my committee finally unveiled a new Kindertransport memorial to the children who had arrived by ship. And there you can see the memorial, which is essentially a gangplank and 5 life-size figures of children setting foot on British soil. It was a remarkable day, and I do recommend you, if you're ever able to get to the Essex port, to go and have a look at this really beautiful and moving memorial statue in bronze. There you can see that was the opening day with the sculptor Dame Stephanie Shirley in white, the German ambassador, myself, and Michael Newman of the AJR, and it was a most remarkable day. One of my most memorable days of my life, certainly. And there was a information board that we put up next to the memorial. And finally, beside buying my book, I wanted just to highlight some work I'm doing for the Washington Holocaust Memorial Museum, US Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm looking for British families who took in Kindertransport children. Those families would be in those siblings of those families would be in their 80s and 90s. They became foster sisters and brothers, if you like, for the Kinder themselves. They must be able to be interviewed by me on Zoom or in person, and the film would be then sent to the US Holocaust Museum. Again, I haven't really got time to show you the interview I did with Susan Johnson, who became a foster sister to a girl from Germany. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of those families around Britain who are not really ever being recorded, and that's what we're doing. We're trying to find the British families that took in the Kinder, and anyone that might be old enough to remember the children arriving in their families. So if you do know, please contact me at that email address, or through Alan, I'm sure, through Millim, and so on. So there's my book, and I think more or less I've come to the end of my talk, and I'm now going to invite you to ask any questions.
Thank you, Mike. Whilst I'm just finding the questions, there was one question we do, which is an easy one, which if you can just repeat it slowly. It was the name of the film about the Dutch lady that you recommended to...
Right, the name of the film is Truss, T-R-U-U-S, T-R-U-U-S. It's Dutch for auntie, I think. Truss's Children. Truss's Children. Again, I can send you links to the film through Millim if you're interested. But it's a wonderful documentary film. It was shown at the Jewish Film Festival last year, and is still doing the rounds. But it is a remarkable film. And
sorry, I'll bring my cell phone now. As I say, doing this two-handed. There we go. So before I move on, there are some questions, but I'm just going to cover a couple of comments. One which, of course, I think people may have picked up, that the Dovercourt Bay holiday camp was not just famous for the Kindertransport, but also, is it not, for being the set of Heidi High, the comedy programme of the 1970s and 80s. So we see exactly what it was like in the 1950s. That is correct, isn't it?
It's correct. The chalets you see on the Heidi High are the 1937-38 chalets.
Yeah. For people who are able to see the comments, Peter McDonough has actually put a link in the chat. If anybody, it should have just appeared in everybody's screen. I'm just going through the comments before we go to I think just for the moment, I'll come back to that. So we've got quite a few questions, so we're going to try and work through these. Right, so David Elter said that his father, aged 9, and his sister, aged 14, escaped on the Kindertransport from Vienna on the 25th of December 1938. A diary was written by his sister describing the journey just as them just going on holiday to England, expecting them to return. Sadly, they never saw their parents again. So that was a comment there. One from Anonymous. Didn't Winton also help the group of 300 children who were taken by train from Prague through Nazi Germany to work as agricultural labourers on Danish farms? Who helped all the over 17s, like my in-laws, get on the trains to the UK as domestic help? Do you know anything about?
I don't, I'm afraid. No, that's the first time I've heard that, so it's worth looking into, but I've never
Yeah,
heard it before.
all the questions are saved, so I can come to that. David Elser, again referencing a relative who was aged 5, living in an orphanage in Poland, was smuggled out of East Poland on the transport to England and was adopted by a Christian family who adopted him, and he became a vicar. And it was at age 86, he did a DNA test to discover his Jewish roots, and he was contacted as the nearest relative by
Remarkable.
right. Holly from Kenosha in Wisconsin, USA, and I thank Holly for a comment earlier on that came up in the chat. She was delighted to see me for the first time. As I said, I'm not often on the screen. And she said, how do you convince Orthodox Jewish parents to let their kinder leave Germany and Austria on Shabbos, a Saturday? It can't have been easy. Yeah, that's true.
Yes, I mean, it's more of a comment than a question, but yes, I mean, I guess when life is at stake, and it was very clear after Kristallnacht, very clear that the Jews were in mortal danger. It wasn't a question of, this might go away or this is as bad as it gets. It was really then very clear that Hitler's designs was on mass extermination, and that given, I can't remember I can't remember the Hebrew term, but there is you can break Shabbat laws if it's a question of life and death. So I guess that was. Having said that, when Schoenfeld organised his trains with the help, not with the help, but with the, with the approval of Chief Rabbi Hertz, he certainly wouldn't allow transports on Shabbat.
It was the same. Is it not the same comment that the current chief rabbi about vaccinations on Shabbos? The same principles as well.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that was it. Anonymous attendee, I'm not quite sure how Anonymous is texting. You're going to have to message me direct. Yes, Tanya Nelson, just going back to the pen, has made the term. It's pen nefesh is the term that allows that. Anonymous attendee says he may have a contact, somebody who might be interested in helping mount a plaque or memorial at Broomfield House. Whoever, Anonymous, you're going to have to email me direct, and I'll get that on to Mike.
Thank you. Long overdue.
Now, Susan Korn said, did David Makowski organise children going to Bradford to the hostel run by her grandmother's sister and husband? Do you remember that?
I know the hostel you mean, because it was on a documentary about several decades ago, wasn't it? The hostel in Bradford. I don't, because it's not Kindertransport related directly. I don't think he did, but who's to say? He was very closely linked to Leeds and Bradford were very closely linked, obviously, and his particular interest was that in slightly older Jewish refugees, those who came over on training visas. So his particular interest was, I don't know whether your relatives were in this age group, but they were slightly older boys often who come over on visas that allowed them into the country on the grounds that they were training for a new skill, which would then be useful in some third country, possibly Palestine.
And there are examples of the letters. I think, isn't it in the West Yorkshire Archive? Have got some, haven't they? About the letters about getting the apprenticeships and training arrangements. They're in the archives.
The Holmakovsky archive there. Yes, you're right.
It is the West Yorkshire Archive. It's not the museum, isn't it? Yeah.
West Yorkshire archives. Yes.
Yeah. Anthony Green in Israel says, did you ever meet any of the people who were in that audience on the That's Life program where they all stood up? Have you ever met any of those?
I think have I met any of them? I don't think I have. I mean, the I know quite a few of the Kinder, but of course we're talking about 40 years ago nearly.
Yes.
So the ones who would have been old enough to be in the audience, let's say in their 30s and 40s, 40 years ago. No, they'd be much older. They were born in the 1930. I'm doing my maths here. So I think the ones who were in the audience probably wouldn't have been around when I was starting to do my research. Although I think Vera Schofeld was one, and she's still around. So I haven't met them, no. I met Barbara Winton, the daughter of Nicholas Winton and Nicholas himself, several times.
Now,
Aside
there is a lot of chat, which oh, I think I've covered all the questions. I just checked there wasn't in, didn't it? Oh, there were a couple of other ones. Um, oh, Eva Vomovich, yes, interesting point. I think I was sort of reflecting on this. Does Mike think that overall male rescuers got more attention than the women ones?
well, I think the attention is almost wholly on Nicholas Winton, and because he's male, you could say that. I can't think of any other, maybe Robert Schonfeld possibly, but within the Jewish community, but at large, I can't think of anyone, male or female, whose names have been generally remembered. I might, I stand corrected on that, but I can't think of any. But probably generally, because women were very much prominent in the welfare, particularly of the children once they were here, one could argue that they're more easily forgotten given the kind of status and sexism of certainly then, if not now.
Yeah.
I mean,
Um,
people
there
often,
are a few people saying they've got stories they might like to forward on to you. Are you okay for me to forward on
yes,
their
please,
email,
yes, please,
your email address?
yes, absolutely.
Right, that's okay. There was a clarification. Alan Sainsbury was not Jewish; he was Christian. That's correct, isn't it?
Oh, yes, that's right. I didn't say he was Jewish, did I?
No, no, no. Somebody just asked, and it was just correct that
He
he.
was of he was from a Jewish family actually. There was a Jewish side to the family. Somebody's quite rightly said his grandmother was one of the Vanderberg family, one of the Jewish Dutch families. You know, the Vanderberg margarines and fats company that went on to be became Unilever or was bought by Unilever.
Yeah.
So he had Jewish roots. Certainly, I don't, but certainly wasn't brought up in any kind of Jewish way.
Um, Tanya Nelson has asked, "What is your background? Is he second generation like me, or Shoah Foundation interviewer?" Does that does that make sense? What's your
I'm a typical Marian Paula Leeds Jew. My grandparents came from Tsarist Russia in the 1880s and 90s, so I don't have any connection to Germany, Austria. No, so I don't have any personal connections. It just happens to be a history that's fascinated me.
And Francis Fields says that David Attenborough's family took in two sisters.
Yes, they did. The Attenborough family took in two German Jewish sisters who kept in touch throughout their lives. I don't think they're alive yet at the moment, but I mean, they're not alive now. But yeah, two German Jewish sisters, and David Attenborough, sorry, Richard Attenborough, has written very movingly about them in his autobiography.
Sylvia Daintree says fascinating talk, which echoes many of the comments that on in the chat, which, as I said, we will save. And also brilliant that there's now a memorial in Harwich. Both her grandfathers, one Jewish, arrived there in 1938 November as political refugees. I think that's a difference on a transport organised by Doreen Varner of the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, another unsung hero.
Just
Um,
out of interest, but on that one, Doreen Warner was yes, you're right. She was based in Prague. She was English British, but she lived in Prague during that period, and she was responsible for the rescue of countless number of political refugees, many of whom were also Jewish, by the way. It's by the way, in a sense. But about a year or two ago, a plaque was unveiled to Doreen Warner in UCL, I think, in London, which is where she had lectured. or was it LSE? But anyway, somewhere in one of the London colleges.
And then, can you just say again who designed the Harwich Memorial? I think we had a couple of questions about that.
Yeah, the Harwich Memorial was designed by a guy called Ian Walter, Wolter, Ian Walter, who is an Essex-based artist and sculptor. We were attracted to his work by some figures called the Children of Calais, which is about the present Calais jungle children, as it were, the children who are refugees today. And it was such a powerful piece that we thought, he's someone that we would like to design our memorial. So yeah, wonderful guy, Ian Walter, Wolter.
A couple of final observations. Prince Philip's mother saved the Cohen family. Was that correct? I don't
know about that.
No, we'd have to. Yvonne will have to look that one up. And apparently, Ella Mark says that Nicholas Winton's daughter died last week.
She certainly died in the middle of October. Yes, she did. I
Yeah.
knew her well, Barbara Winton, and I knew that she'd been ill for a long time. And it's a great shame because she was taking up the reins, if you like, of her father's work. She was determined to work for, particularly for current refugees, using her father's history as a background. So great
Oh,
loss.
someone, Alan Marlin. I can see how I missed it because it was a time stamp. Trevor Chadwick.
Yeah.
Who do you know anything? Do you know the story there?
Yeah, also, it's funny, it's statue time because Trevor Chadwick's statue has been unveiled in Swanage, I think, in Dorset. He was with Doreen Warrener in Prague, and he stayed in Prague right through to after the Nazis invaded in March 39, helping to organise the Czech end of the Winton trains. Nicholas Winton only spent 2 weeks, I think, in Prague. Then he came back to organise the British end of the rescue. Trevor Chadwick stayed in Prague under the noses of the Nazis to organise the rescue at that end. So a remarkable figure as a teacher, I think, who just decided to take a year's break from his work and stay in Prague until the job was done. Remarkable figure.
I've just picked up an email from Gillian Ansel Browner, who I know is watching, but she sent me an email saying that Jerry Klinger has been instrumental in many of the memorials in the UK to people whose names remained unknown to mark their courage. Whether they were rescued or made a difference to the war, or whether they were British and their service were extraordinary. The Jewish American Society for Historical Preservation is Jerry's pioneering venture and have placed markers in London, created a graveside memorial and a dedication to Ajax and the UK JASHP branch in Manchester. Are you aware of Jerry?
I'm aware of it, but I can't tell you very much more than what.
Yeah, that's just a bit of there. Yeah. And just again to clarify, I think it was Princess Anna. Princess Anna took Jewish people in, but that in Athens. Yes,
well, she's certainly got the award of Righteous Among Nations from Yad Vashem, I think, for that.
And we are coming. I'm getting too many now. Where are we? There was a little interesting. Are you aware that Tanya Winnelson says, "Are you aware of the Quaker quilt in their museum in Kendal depicting the rescue work?"
Yes, I am. Yes, I mean, again, the Quakers. It's a remarkable story and one that ought to be better known. But yes, I have come across that idea of it's something the Quakers love doing. I think is creating commemorative quilts, and they're really good at it.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we've covered a lot, and unless there's anything pressing, as you say, thank you, Mike, so much for being our guest on this occasion. There's a little round of applause, hands coming up now, and hearts.
Thank you. Thank you.
But Mike, as I said, Mike is a very good friend of Miriam, so he will be round again in different guises, and I'm sure I'll make sure that in the email that goes out, I'll explain we're going to do something slightly different with email in a moment to make sure that people can get your book, and I'll include your email.
Thank you so much.
For messages. And if you'd like to buy Mike's book, there was the link on the website, and I'll include it in the email, which I will send out tomorrow. And it's well worth a read. Buying it through the link does help Million, but it will cost you the same. It's just that we get a little bit of commission, but Mike gets all his benefits. I know that.
No,
So
no,
that's okay. So and what's going to happen tomorrow, there'll actually be 2 emails, if that's all right. I think we're going to do it in 2 ways. There's the automatic one that comes out after the talk, but there's also the next, the monthly one, which is going to list all the talks that are coming up, which I'll come to in a moment. Now, at this point, our dear friend Jonathan will say, I'm going to give you a gift of his photography of Mag and David Dodd, but obviously he's not here. I haven't got the book and I can't do it. But as Mike's going to be coming up, as I said, Mike is going to be coming up, well, he's regularly up in Leeds. We will sort out a little thank you for you. So just about what's coming up. And we're now back. We have got a complete set of 4 talks coming up in November. Next week, we have Jonathan Lewis, who I think has been actually on this listening in, talking about chaplaincy in the armed forces. That's a joint talk with the Leeds branch of the Jewish Historical Society. The following week, on the 14th, we're delighted to welcome Mark Ludwig, who is the director of the Theresian Music Foundation. He's doing a musical presentation, Our Will to Live, Art and Music in Theresian, looks at the astonishing artistic community that rose in the Theresienstadt Nazi camp. On the 21st of November, we are going to have back Linus Bradis, who will be talking about the Vilnius. This is going to be the online version of the talk that took place in Leeds last month, well, this month, about 3 weeks ago, which unfortunately there were problems with the sound. And I know there's a lot of people did book, and we do apologise, but we worked out there's some practical issues we've got to look at. But Linus is going to come back, he's going to do the talk, but he's going to add a lot of extra other bits in, so it will be of interest to those people who even attended. And finally, now this is the important one, the final talk in the final week of November is actually on the Wednesday, the 30th of November. It's unfortunately we couldn't work it out. Jonathan wasn't able to do it, and it worked out. It's going to be better on the Wednesday, the 30th of November, when our very own, it's written here, our very own Lawrence Saffer, who, for those of you who know in Leeds, is now president of the Jewish Rep Council, will be discussing his book, Plumber, Lecturer, Pacifist Spy, How Uncle Cyril Saved the World. And just to reassure everybody, Jonathan is all right. He's just in, yes, somebody's just confirmed he's in Israel on a photography assignment. So again, I'm going to thank all full details on the Minute website. The newsletter will be coming out and the regular reminders. As we always say, this is where I've got to press a couple of buttons, which do yourself. All our events are free, but you can make a donation either through the link on the website, in the emails that come out, but I am putting the link into, which is not working, that's it, into the chat now. And again, and as all our events are free, and but there are costs involved, so every donation is most welcome. And again, I'm now going to bring Mike back, which, as I said, doing it all myself, it's not always easy, this. Here we go. There we go. And I'm now on the other side. And it remains me to thank you, our guest, Mike Levy, once again for coming. It's been absolutely fascinating. And just by the number of questions and comments that have appeared on the screen, and yes, and I'll make sure that... there's a very interesting comment, actually. I will just mention it. This could be an interesting link. Jerry asks from an anonymous attendee, as I said, if anonymous attendee can contact me direct through the link, the email that's in the link. Jerry, this was Jerry, who was the chap in America about the memorials, has asked you that you contact him about the memorial. So we'll try and link you up with that about on the Bloomsbury building. So if that comes out, that will out of this, it will be most interesting. So again, thank you, Mike Levy, for coming. Thank you everybody for coming, tolerating my having to do things all at the same time. It's the best I can do. Looking forward to seeing you at one or all of our future events. Until